On February 26, 2022, just 2 days after Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine, the United States and the European Union made a decision that would prove to be historic. A decision not aimed only at Russia, but one that would fundamentally alter the global financial system for a very long time. Thereafter, they announced Russia's removal from SWIFT, short for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication Network. This is the financial messaging system, connecting more than 11,000 banks across nearly 200 countries, processing roughly $5 trillion in transactions every day. SWIFT is the lifeblood of international money flows. Being cut off from SWIFT means that Russian banks can almost no longer send or receive international payments. No more trade finance. No more cross-border transactions. Russia's economy was pushed into financial isolation, almost completely. At the time, the West celebrated this decision as the ultimate financial sanction. They believed Russia would be totally paralyzed. The ruble would collapse and the economy would implode from within. And eventually, President Putin would either withdraw troops from Ukraine or face a wave of domestic uprisings. But 2.5 years later, the unthinkable happened. Russia did not collapse and the ruble gradually recovered. Russia's trade activities continued. They just no longer went through SWIFT. Russia found alternative routes. And worse for the West, dozens of other countries watched the entire process unfold and began building contingency plans of their own. Because if the United States could remove Russia from the global financial system for political reasons, then in theory, any country could become the next target in line. In fact, this was not the first time a dominant power turned financial infrastructure into a weapon. Over the past 110 years, this scenario has occurred 4 times, and notably, in all 4 cases, events followed the same pattern. The dominant power controls the global financial system and uses that power to punish its rivals. Targeted countries are forced to seek alternatives. Neutral nations quietly hedge against risk. And over time, the financial weapon itself gradually loses effectiveness. The dominant power believes it holds the ultimate lever of control. But in reality, it is slowly destroying the foundations of its own dominance. Now, let us revisit 4 historical examples to clearly see this pattern. This is a 5-stage model that repeats itself every time. History witnesses the weaponization of the financial system. And concrete data shows this model is unfolding right now with SWIFT and the US dollar. It also explains why China is emerging as the most obvious beneficiary and why the timeline suggests the United States has only about 20 years before the dollar completely loses its status as the global reserve currency. Because history has followed this script before. In 1914, when Britain began turning finance into a tool of sanctions, the decline of its reserve currency status also began. 30 years later, in 1944, the British pound officially lost its central role. By 2022, the United States entered a similar path by weaponizing the SWIFT system. From that moment, the clock began counting down. And this time, everything will move much faster. Because alternatives already exist, and modern technology continues to accelerate every process. Before examining why weaponizing SWIFT backfires, we must clarify one crucial point. What exactly is SWIFT, and why does this system play such a critical role? SWIFT is not a bank. It does not hold anyone's money. Nor does it directly execute fund transfers. SWIFT is essentially a financial messaging system. When Bank A in New York wants to send $1 million to Bank B in Tokyo, SWIFT transmits a secure message between the two. The message itself is simple. It essentially confirms that Bank A authorizes the transfer of $1 million to Bank B. The actual movement of money occurs through correspondent banking relationships. But SWIFT is the communication network that makes the entire process run smoothly. The system was established in 1973 by 239 banks from 15 countries. Before SWIFT, international payments relied on the telex system, which was slow, insecure, and highly error-prone. SWIFT standardized message formats, set security standards, and made cross-border transactions fast and reliable by 1977. SWIFT was processing about 10 million messages per year. By 2024, that number exceeded 11 billion messages annually, equivalent to roughly 45 million messages per day. SWIFT gradually became the nervous system of global finance. And it is here that SWIFT's true power became evident. SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium and is nominally a neutral organization. However, its board of directors is dominated by US and European banks. More importantly, the United States holds enormous legal leverage because most international transactions are settled in US dollars and must pass through banks in New York. This means the US can exert pressure to force SWIFT to remove a country or a bank from the system. Once cut off from SWIFT, international trade becomes nearly impossible, pushing the economy into isolation in practical terms. The United States had used this financial weapon before. In 2012, the U.S. pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks. This was an extremely severe blow to Iran. Oil exports nearly collapsed, not because there were no buyers, but because buyers could not make payments. Iran's economy contracted by 9%. Inflation surged to 45%. The sanctions forced Iran to the negotiating table, leading to the 2015 nuclear agreement. At that time, the SWIFT weapon appeared to be effective. But during the years under sanctions, Iran did not stand still. It quietly built alternative payment channels, expanded barter-based trade, experimented with cryptocurrencies, and intensified non-dollar trade with China, Russia, and Turkey. When sanctions returned in 2018, Iran proved far more resilient because it had significantly reduced its dependence on SWIFT. But Russia's removal from SWIFT in 2022 was a completely different story. This was no small economy like Iran, but the world's 11th largest economy, a major energy exporting power, a nuclear-armed state, and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Removing Russia from SWIFT was not merely an act of economic warfare. It was a clear declaration that the US-controlled financial system could exclude any country for political reasons. And every country watching understood that message perfectly. The message was unmistakable. If you go against US interests, you can be denied access to the global financial system. Your foreign exchange reserves can be frozen. Your banks can be isolated. And your economy can be strangled. This raises a critical question for every non-Western country. Do you accept living permanently vulnerable to US financial power? Or do you proactively build alternatives? Most countries chose the second path. And from that moment, the SWIFT weapon began to backfire. Now let us revisit 4 historical precedents. Because whenever finance is weaponized, a backlash almost always follows. Over the past century, this pattern has repeated 4 times. And every time, the dominant power believed it held the decisive advantage. Yet in the end, it unintentionally accelerated the decline of the power it once possessed. The first example is Britain during World War I, from 1914 to 1918. Before the war broke out, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the global financial center, and Britain controlled the share of the US dollar in global reserves. When war began in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. This law allowed the British government to freeze assets of German individuals and companies. Britain seized German-owned businesses, bank accounts, ships, and assets across the British Empire. This was an unprecedented move. Before that, international finance had been considered separate from war itself. In earlier conflicts, belligerents fought on the battlefield, while still honoring financial contracts. Britain broke that norm. The immediate consequences for Germany were devastating. German businesses lost assets worldwide. German banks lost access to London's financial markets. German trade collapsed. Britain believed this gave it a decisive advantage. But meanwhile, neutral countries were watching closely and drawing a dangerous lesson. If Britain could seize German assets, it could do the same to any country. In any conflict Britain deemed important, money held in London was no longer safe, unless your government had Britain's approval. After World War I, neutral countries began diversifying their reserves, reducing dependence on London. They increased gold holdings and opened accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers. The United States benefited the most from this shift. Banks in New York quickly absorbed transaction flows once routed through London. Previously, by 1920, the U.S. held more gold reserves than Britain. And by 1925, New York had risen to rival London as a global financial center. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the US dollar officially replaced the British pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's weaponization of finance, beginning in 1914, triggered a 30-year cycle of decline. From dominance to historical marginalization, the pattern is now unmistakable. Britain controlled the system and turned it into a weapon. Neutral countries began to diversify and withdraw from Britain's sphere of control. As a result, Britain gradually lost control. That was the first example. Now comes the second example, the United States and Iran. In 1979, after Iranian revolutionaries took American hostages in November, President Carter ordered the freezing of all Iranian assets held in U.S. banks, totaling approximately $12 billion, including $8 billion in bank deposits and $4 billion in other assets. This was the largest asset freeze in history. At that time, the justification was explicit. Iran had violated international law by taking hostages, while the U.S. claimed it was protecting its citizens. This freeze created immense economic pressure, forcing Iran to reconsider releasing the hostages. However, that asset freeze created unintended consequences. Countries around the world, especially in the Middle East and within OPEC, suddenly realized that their dollar reserves held in U.S. banks could be seized at any moment, without a military war or a sovereign default, simply through an executive order. With just one phone call, the U.S. president could freeze your assets. What was called national sovereignty was no longer truly sovereign, if it existed in dollars and was held in New York. Entering the 1980s, OPEC countries began diversifying their foreign reserves. They reduced their dollar holdings from about 85% in 1970 down to around 71% by 1991. This was a direct response to the lesson left by the Iranian asset freeze. They significantly increased holdings of the Deutsche Mark, the Japanese yen, and gold. At the same time, they opened accounts in London, Zurich, and Singapore to avoid concentrating too many assets in New York. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE also simultaneously reduced their holdings of U.S. treasuries. From that point on, the share of the U.S. dollar in global reserves began a slow but persistent decline that continues to this day. Tactically speaking, the Iranian asset freeze was still considered a success. The hostages were released in January 1981, partly due to economic pressure. But strategically, this action taught the world an important lesson. Dollar reserves could be weaponized. Every country understood it had to diversify. The U.S. gained additional leverage over Iran, but in return suffered an erosion of trust from the rest of the world. The third example is the relationship between the U.S. and Russia in 2014. When Russia annexed Crimea in March of that year, the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions. Many Russian officials were barred from accessing the U.S. financial system, and Russian banks also faced numerous restrictions. However, Russia was not yet cut off from SWIFT. The sanctions were designed to signal opposition, but were not strong enough to force Russia to fully switch to alternative systems. This was a strategic mistake by the U.S., as it inadvertently gave Russia 8 more years to prepare. From 2014 to 2022, Russia systematically reduced its dependence on the U.S. dollar. Russia cut its hold of U.S. Treasury bonds from $130 billion in 2010 to just about $2 billion by 2020. Russia developed the SPFS system, a financial messaging system, serving as its own version of SWIFT. At the same time, Russia negotiated trade agreements with China, India, and many other countries, allowing settlements in yuan or rupees instead of U.S. dollars. Russia also built an entire infrastructure to support non-dollar trade. In speeches throughout the period from 2014 to 2022, President Putin repeatedly stated publicly that Russia was reducing its exposure to the dollar because dollar reserves were no longer safe. He openly said that the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, and Russia needed financial independence. Many Western analysts at the time believed these statements were merely rhetorical. They believed Russia was deeply integrated into the global economy and could not decouple. But reality showed that Russia was entirely serious, and when the sanctions of 2022 were imposed, Russia was ready. The 2014 sanctions were only partially effective. Russia's economic growth slowed and capital fled. But at the same time, those very sanctions gave Russia what it needed most: time and motivation to build alternatives. If the U.S. had either done nothing or imposed comprehensive SWIFT sanctions, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, the U.S. chose a middle path, sending tough signals, while giving Russia enough room to prepare. This turned out to be the worst possible choice. The fourth example is the relationship between the U.S. and Russia in 2022. This was the real turning point. On February 27, 2022, the U.S. and the European Union announced the removal of major Russian banks from SWIFT. At the same time, about $300 billion in reserves of the Russian central bank, held at Western financial institutions, were frozen. This was considered the ultimate financial sanction. Russia was financially isolated on an unprecedented scale. The immediate impact was severe. the ruble plunged by about 30%. In just 2 days, the Russian stock market was forced to close to prevent collapse. ATMs quickly ran out of cash. Western media declared an economic victory, believing Russia would collapse within months. But once again, the unexpected happened. Russia gradually stabilized. The Central Bank of Russia raised interest rates sharply to 20%, thereby halting the ruble's collapse. Russia required European countries to pay for gas in rubles, thereby creating forced demand for the currency. Within just 3 months, the ruble had fully recovered its previous losses. Russia's trade continued, just no longer through Western channels. Russia quickly redirected its oil exports to China, India, and the Middle East region. Trade transactions were settled in renminbi, ruble, and rupee. By the end of 2022, Russia's economy had largely stabilized again. By 2030, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6%, faster than both Germany and the UK. But the real damage was not in Russia. The greatest damage was done to the dollar and the system. Because every country watching understood that. The United States is willing to freeze reserves and cut countries off purely for political reasons. If you are China, India, Saudi Arabia, or Brazil, you would ask yourself. Today, we are not in confrontation with the United States. But what if disagreements arise tomorrow? Taiwan, Kashmir, Yemen. Trade policy. Any issue could become a flashpoint. Could the United States freeze trillions of dollars of our reserves? Could it cut us off from SWIFT? The answer is clearly yes, a precedent has been set. So what did those countries do? They did exactly what Britain's enemies did in 1914, and what Iran, even as an ally, did in 1960. They began diversifying away from the dollar and the SWIFT system. They built alternative options. And from that moment, the 5-stage backlash model began to operate. Now let us look at this 5-stage framework to understand why financial weapons always backfire. It has happened 4 times in history, and it is happening right now. Stage 1. The dominant power controls the payment system. From 1973 to 2022, the United States effectively controlled SWIFT. Not directly. SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium. But because most transactions on SWIFT are settled in dollars and pass through correspondent banks in New York, the United States holds decisive leverage. The U.S. Treasury can sanction banks. The Federal Reserve can cut access to the dollar payment system, and SWIFT cannot function smoothly without cooperation from the United States. In other words, the United States controls SWIFT by controlling the dollar. The dollar became the dominant currency, thanks to America's economic and military power, changing their operations of its global financial power solely on kerosene for lighting. Stage 2 is the weaponization of that system for foreign policy gasoline, goals. Diesel, from 2001, lubricants, and asphalt. To teal. Oil was no longer a product. The United States increasingly used financial sanctions, each one after September 11th. The first the U.S. targeted terrorist financing became symbols of modernity. Then the scope expanded to countries deemed threat, watching them with wonder and suspicion, such as Iran and Engines North Korea. Made noises, and then Russia in 2014. The smell of burning gasoline, each escalation drifted through the air, made like financial warfare increasingly normalized. And no matter the complaints of those loyal to gentle horse-drawn when Russia launched its military operations, Ukraine had begun to turn. The use of SWIFT as a weapon was almost automatic. To move, distance lost. The infrastructure was ready. The president was ready. Took an entire and the political will was ready. Now took an hour. So the United States decided to cut Russia off from SWIFT and freeze roughly $300 billion in reserves. People realized engines did more than make them travel. Begins when the targets find alternatives. They changed how they perceive the world. Unable to use SWIFT, they shift to other systems. And petroleum, SPFS, its new Russia's domestic became the heartbeat of that shrinking was rapidly expanded, but engines did not. At the same time, China's cross-border main channels for Russian trade were tested. In some transactions were conducted via. At first, the flights were short. Others through barter trade, swaying like small boats tossed by waves. By 2024, propellers spun, wings lengthened. Around 40% of Russia's trade was conducted in non-U.S. dollar lifted humanity. Bilateral trade between Russia and China. In the diaries of early pilots, some wrote that the smell reached around $240 billion in 2023. Freedom. Almost entirely settled in renminbi. Trade between Russia and India primarily used the rupee burned to open the road for Russia and the UAE settled trade in dirhams. Once a black substance used Russia only to seal boats had become the lifeblood of machines. The country can still survive and run its economy. Even when cut off, engineers and governments realize this. A new stage 4 is when neutral countries, whoever controls oil, controls movement, begin to hedge against not just the movement of machines, but the movement of economies, of trade. It is not only Russia seeking alternatives, history itself, of other countries, but to fully understand the truth. Even if humanity would have to pass through the first great trial of the engine age, they could become targets. World War China watched the entire episode when the first explosion and accelerated the process of de-dollarization. China reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds black liquid from $1.3 trillion. It was about to become in 2013 pivot the entire conflict to around $775 billion by 24 in artillery, in the number of soldiers. At the same time, China sharply increased its gold officially trusted tactics forged in the fires of older wars. Is 24 tons. But many estimates suggest the actual amount was no longer could exceed 4 tons cavalry charges. China also massively expanded the SIP systems, with transaction values rising from around $300 million to move. In 2020, when war erupted, those machines demanded fuel to over $500 billion. On the mud-choked battlefields of Somme and Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally for 80 years, witnessed reserve freezes firsthand, began to falter. Mud and began reassessing its strategic position. Terrified them. Thousands of horses died each week, and generals started to realize Saudi Arabia announced it would accept the renminbi in oil sales to China, but replacing them required something this move broke the 50-year monopoly of the petrodollar system. By December 2024, Saudi Arabia joined BRICS, sending a clear signal of moving away from exclusive dependence on the United States in the Gulf. Also began settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams, bypassing the dollar. Meanwhile, Brazil and Argentina entered negotiations on a common currency to facilitate bilateral trade, the BRICS bloc. After expanding with new members such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, they are moving forward with building their own cross-border payment system. At the same time, they're also studying the possibility of creating a common currency, potentially backed by gold and other strategic commodities. Even U.S. allies have begun to hedge their risks. The European Union developed an alternative payment mechanism called Instex, initially for trade with Iran, but in theory expandable to other purposes. Japan and South Korea are also increasing their holdings of the Chinese yuan in foreign exchange reserves. Today, more than 50 central banks worldwide are experimenting with or deploying systems to reduce dependence on the US dollar and SWIFT. This is not driven by anti-American sentiment, but by a very practical lesson. They witnessed how $300 billion could be frozen by a single executive order. They realized their reserves were no longer truly safe. Phase 5 is when the original weapon begins to lose its power. And this is exactly where the United States stands today. SWIFT still retains its dominant role, but the downward trend is unmistakable. The share of the US dollar in global reserves has fallen from 71% in 1999 to around 58% by 2020. That is a drop of 13 percentage points, equivalent to trillions of dollars, reallocated into other assets and currencies. More importantly, the dollar's share in international trade settlements is also plunging from about 73% in 22 to roughly 58% by 24. In just 2 years, the decline reached 15 percentage points. This is the fastest de-dollarization process in modern history. The volume of messages on SWIFT continues to grow in absolute terms, but SWIFT's share of total international financial message shrinking. China's SIP system processed around 136 million messages in 2020, up from 91 million messages in 22, representing nearly 50% growth in just 1 year. Meanwhile, Russia's SPF processes about 2 million messages per day for domestic transactions. These figures show that alternative systems are growing very rapidly. In India, the UPI payment system processed up to 12 billion transactions in 2020, including a rapidly growing volume of cross-border transactions. As a result, alternative systems are expanding at breakneck speed. And this is the key point to understand. The SWIFT weapon is only effective in the short term, at a tactical level. Russia's economy suffered an initial shock, but strategically, the sanctions failed. Russia did not collapse. And more importantly, the SWIFT weapon will never again be usable as effectively as before, because countries now anticipate this scenario and prepare countermeasures in advance. Even neutral countries have built alternative options, making them far less vulnerable than before. This is the repeating pattern. Phase 1 is controlling the system. Phase 2 is weaponizing the system. Phase 3, targeted countries seek alternatives. Phase 4, neutral countries begin risk hedging. In Phase 5, the original weapon gradually loses power. The United Kingdom went through this cycle from 1914 to 1944. And the United States is now on the same path, starting in 2022 and extending to around 2040. Now let's look at concrete data proving this is happening right now. These are not predictions, but real-world numbers. First, Russia's trade data. In 2020, before sanctions were imposed, 87% of Russia's trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2021, that figure dropped to about 60%. This means 40% of Russia's trade today is settled in yuan, rupees, dirhams, and other currencies. Bilateral trade between Russia and China reached about $240 billion, almost entirely settled in yuan and rubles. Trade between Russia and India reached roughly $60 billion, mostly settled in rupees. Russia has become a real-world test case, demonstrating that an economy can still function outside the dollar system. Now turning to China's SIP system. In 2020, SIPs processed about $12 trillion in transactions over the entire year. By 2020, this figure had risen to around $27 trillion, more than doubling in just 3 years. Today, SIPs connects over 400 financial institutions across 110 countries and territories. Transactions are settled directly in yuan. This is a direct alternative to dollar-based SWIFT, and SIP's growth is now even faster than SWIFT's. Another very clear signal is central bank gold purchases. In 2022, central banks worldwide bought 1,036 tons of gold in 2023. The figure was around 1,007 tons, and in 24, it again exceeded the 1,000-ton mark. This marks 3 consecutive years with purchases above 1,000 tons, the highest sustained level since the 1990s, before the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Who are the biggest gold buyers? China, Russia, Turkey, India, and Poland. Singapore and the Czech Republic. These countries are proactively shifting their dollar reserves into gold because gold cannot be frozen or sanctioned by political decisions. Alongside this are bilateral currency swap agreements. China currently has currency swap agreements with more than 40 countries, with a total value of roughly $500 billion. These agreements allow countries to settle trade directly in their local currencies without going through the US dollar. Notably, China has swap agreements with India and Iran. India also has similar agreements with the UAE, Japan, and many other countries. Brazil and Argentina are negotiating a common currency for bilateral trade. Meanwhile, ASEAN countries are also discussing settling intra-bloc trade in local currencies. All of these moves bypass the petrodollar system. For 50 years, oil was almost exclusively priced and traded in US dollars. This created a structural demand for the dollar. But by the period from 2023 to 24, this monopoly was officially broken. Saudi Arabia accepted payments in yuan for oil transactions with China. Russia sells oil to India in Indian rupees. The UAE accepts dirhams and yuan. Iran sells oil to China in yuan. Iraq is also negotiating to accept payments in yuan. The petrodollar system has not disappeared entirely, but it no longer holds a monopoly. And once that monopoly is broken, the advantages that come with it quickly erode. The expansion of BRICS is closely tied to monetary development. After expanding from 5 to 10 members in 2022, BRICS now accounts around 45% of the world's population, about 30% of global GDP in nominal terms, and over 36% in purchasing power parity terms. The bloc also controls more than 40% of global oil production. At the 23 BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, member states announced plans to develop a common BRICS currency. This currency is proposed to be backed by a basket of commodities, including gold, oil, and strategic minerals such as rare earths. This plan has not yet been implemented in practice, but the signal is unmistakable. BRICS is steadily building an alternative system to the dollar-centered order. The data is highly convincing. De-dollarization is no longer a distant future threat. It is happening right now, and the pace is accelerating. With each passing month, the dollar's share of global reserves declines further. Each quarter, transaction volumes through CEAPs continue to rise. Each year, more and more trade is settled in local currencies. It is precisely the weaponization of SWIFT that has eroded the dollar's monopoly. Now let's look at the timeline. How much time does the United States have before the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency? We can estimate this by looking back at Britain's decline in the past. In 1914, Britain weaponized finance by seizing German assets. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the US dollar officially replaced the British pound as the world's reserve currency. From weaponizing finance to losing reserve status, Britain took exactly 30 years. However, Britain also endured 2 world wars that devastated its economy. Weaponizing finance alone was not enough to destroy the pound. That decline was the combined result of financial weaponization, world wars, and poor economic management. The United States today is not fighting world wars, so its economy remains the largest in the world. Therefore, the decline may occur more slowly. But modern technology is accelerating everything. If in 1940, building alternative payment systems took decades, that is no longer true today. By 2024, the SIP system expanded, processing from about $12 trillion to $27 trillion in just 3 years. Digital payment systems can scale exponentially. As a result, the dollar's decline may occur far faster than before. Based on historical models and current speed, a reasonable time frame is estimated at 15 to 25 years from 2022. This places the decline of the dollar's reserve role around the period from 2037 to 2047. The dollar will not disappear entirely, but it will no longer dominate. The dollar's share of global reserves could fall from about 58% today to roughly 35 to 40%. It will remain an important currency, but no longer hegemonic. In that landscape, the euro may account for around 25%, while gold and other assets could make up 15 to 20%. A multipolar monetary world is taking shape, and this trajectory is already set. Between 1999 and 2024 alone, the dollar's share of global reserves fell by 13 percentage points, equivalent to 25 years of steady decline. If the pace remains unchanged, equivalent to 25 years of continuous decline. If the pace remains the same as before, a further decline of 13 percentage points would push the share of the US dollar down to around 45% by the year 2049. But the problem is that the pace of decline is accelerating. In just the past 2 years alone, this share has fallen by 4 percentage points. If that trend continues to accelerate, the 45% threshold could arrive much sooner, possibly as early as around the year 2035. Therefore, the realistic time frame is not centuries or multiple generations, but only around 10 to 25 years. That is 1 or 2 decades. And this carries very specific implications. At the present moment, the United States can still sustain budget deficits almost without limit because the entire world still needs dollars for trade and reserves. Foreign countries buy U.S. Treasury bonds in order to obtain dollars. As a result, the U.S. can borrow around $2 trillion per year at low interest rates. The United States is effectively exporting inflation to the rest of the world through the dominant position of the U.S. dollar. But when the dollar's share of global reserves falls below 40%, this advantage will disappear. When foreign demand for U.S. Treasury bonds collapses, interest rates in the U.S. will surge. Maintaining budget deficits will become impossible. The U.S. will be forced to balance its budget or face high inflation. The standard of living of Americans, which depends on importing more than exporting and paying for it with newly printed dollars, will no longer be sustainable. Now, let us examine who the winners and losers are. The winner, China, wins big. China is emerging as the most obvious successor to America's financial dominance in the global system. China has the world's second largest economy, the largest manufacturing base, the largest trade volume, and a currency that is increasingly used as a reserve. SIPs can be seen as China's VIP version of SWIFT. The renminbi is gradually becoming a reserve currency. China also holds massive gold reserve. In addition, Chinese tech giants such as Alibaba and Tencent are providing payment infrastructure that can directly compete with Western financial systems. As the dollar weakens, the renminbi will rise. China does not need to defeat the U.S. militarily. China simply needs to patiently wait for the dollar to collapse under its own internal contradictions, which are being accelerated by America's weaponization of its own financial system. Russia is also a strategic beneficiary. Despite having a smaller economy than China, Russia has proven that a country can survive even when cut off from the system. This demonstration effect is extremely important. Every country that once feared America's financial power now knows that an alternative path always exists. Russia's resilience has shattered the myth of absolute American financial power. At the same time, Russia has deepened ties with China, India, Iran, and many other countries. Russia is no longer isolated. On the contrary, it is becoming a central node in an alternative financial bloc network. BRICS countries are clear beneficiaries, such as Brazil, India, and South Africa, along with new members like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia. All benefit from a multipolar monetary system. They gain greater strategic leverage. They can flexibly balance relations between the US, China, and the European Union, rather than being trapped in dependence on the dollar. India is the clearest example. Despite pressure from the US, India maintains ties with Russia. It buys Russian oil at a discount, pays in rupees, and suffers no serious consequences. That is the future of mid-sized powers. Greater autonomy and less subjugation to US power. Gold is also a winner. As countries gradually lose trust in fiat currencies, they turn to gold as a safe haven. Central bank gold purchases are now at their highest level in 50 years. Alternative payment systems are direct beneficiaries. China's CIS, Russia's SPFS, India's UPI, Brazil's PIX, along with cryptocurrency exchanges. Any system that enables transactions without the dollar and without reliance on SWIFT is gaining market share. Fintech companies in China, India, Russia, and many other regions also benefit from the trend away from Western financial systems. So who is the loser? That is the United States. Not immediately, not in a catastrophic collapse, but as a gradual decline that is almost impossible to reverse. The dollar's reserve currency status is the foundation of American power. It allows the US to run near unlimited deficits. It makes sanctions effective. And it allows the US to sustain a standard of above its actual productive capacity. As dollar dominance fades, all of these advantages gradually disappear. The US will be forced to balance its budget. The US military will become prohibitively expensive without the ability to borrow almost without limits. The living standards of Americans will decline relatively compared to the rest of the world. This does not mean the United States will become poor. It simply means America will become more normal. A large, wealthy nation, but no longer an exceptional superpower. Europe will also lose alongside the United States. European countries have tied their fate closely to the US dollar system. They joined US sanctions against Russia. They froze Russia's reserves. They cut Russia off from SWIFT. This aligned Europe with US policy, but also dragged Europe onto the same declining trajectory as the dollar. The euro could have become an alternative to the US dollar. Europe did not pursue that goal decisively. Instead, Europe chose to follow US leadership. Therefore, when the dollar weakens, the euro does not automatically rise. The currency that benefits the most is actually the renminbi. As a result, Europe gradually falls into a position of economic dependence on both the United States and China. SWIFT itself is also losing its central role. Despite being a company headquartered in Belgium, SWIFT is increasingly seen as a tool of the West. As countries diversify and move away from Western financial systems, the usage of SWIFT declines accordingly. SWIFT will not disappear, but it will become just one of many systems for payment messaging, coexisting in parallel, rather than holding absolute dominance as before. SWIFT's revenue comes from transaction fees. As traffic gradually shifts to SIPs, as traffic gradually shifts to SHIP, SPFS, and other systems, those who hold dollars are the ones who lose. Anyone holding dollar-denominated assets, from treasury bonds to bank accounts and other financial instruments, faces depreciation. This is not hyperinflation, not a collapse overnight, but sustained inflation of around 5 to 10% per year. As the purchasing power of the dollar declines against other currencies and gold, a U.S. Treasury bond yielding 4%, but losing 7% in value due to inflation and currency depreciation, effectively delivers a negative real return. Faced with this reality, investors are forced to exit dollar-denominated assets and seek alternatives. This further accelerates the weakening of the dollar. American consumers therefore lose purchasing power. The United States imports more than it exports, with a trade deficit of around $800 billion per year. This condition can only persist because other countries are still willing to hold dollars. When that is no longer the case, the U.S. must export more or import less. The consequence is fewer goods, higher prices, and a lower standard of living. A typical American household, long accustomed to cheap goods from China, cheap foreign oil, and low-cost imports of all kinds, will face a very different reality. As the dollar gradually loses its reserve currency status, prices could rise by 20 to 30%. Over the course of a decade, the timeline has been set, and the starting point was the year 2022, when the SWIFT weapon was used. That event triggered a 5-stage backlash model, consisting of 5 phases. The world is currently in Phase 4, where neutral countries proactively hedge risks. Phase 5, when financial weapons lose effectiveness, is beginning right now. By the year 2030, the dollar's share of global reserves will likely fall to around 50%. By 2040, that figure may drop to around 40%. The United States will still hold the currency, with the largest share in the global system, but it will no longer enjoy absolute dominance. The world is entering a multipolar monetary order. And in that order, U.S. power will decline compared to the past. Let's conclude with this. The SWIFT weapon once appeared overwhelmingly powerful. In February 2022, Russia's reserves were frozen. Maximum pressure was applied. But financial weapons are like nuclear weapons. You can only use them once. After they are used, everyone begins building defenses. Russia built alternatives. China accelerated the development of ship. BRICS expanded and the petrodollar system was fractured. And by now, the SWIFT weapon has become nearly ineffective. Because any country the U.S. might target already has alternatives, or is rapidly building them. The United States could have maintained dollar dominance through economic strength, free trade and rules-based principles. But instead it chose to weaponize finance, freezing assets, cutting countries off from SWIFT and using the dollar as a tool of political coercion. This approach worked tactically against smaller countries like Iran. But when applied to Russia, it backfired. And this backlash is systemic. It is not only Russia leaving the dollar system, but nearly half the world. In 1914, Britain weaponized finance, and by 1944, it lost its reserve currency status. In 2022, the U.S. weaponized SWIFT following the same historical pattern. The U.S. will lose dollar dominance around the year 2042, possibly even sooner, because technology accelerates everything. This is not a prediction. This is pattern recognition. Financial weapons always backfire. The dominant power believes it is using the ultimate leverage. But in reality, it is teaching the world how to build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, the original system gradually loses power. The SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's own monopoly. The dollar weapon eroded the dollar's hegemonic power. And the country that benefited the most from this process is China. The patient rival quietly watched the United States destroy its own advantages. China did not defeat the U.S. militarily, and it did not need to. The United States defeated itself by weaponizing the very tools that created its dominance. In the first place, the five-stage model is now complete. The U.S. controlled SWIFT and the dollar. The U.S. used them as weapons against Russia, and Russia found an alternative path. More than 50 countries are now actively hedging, and this financial weapon is steadily losing effectiveness. This is the end of dollar hegemony. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not through military defeat, but through financial self-destruction. The SWIFT weapon only works once, and it will never be as effective again. Because the world has learned the lesson, and that lesson is clear. Build alternatives and diversify. Move away from dependence on the dollar, and never place yourself in a position of vulnerability to U.S. financial power ever again. If you understand that financial weapons always backfire, if you realize that cutting countries off from SWIFT is not the peak of dollar power, but the beginning of its decline, then you will understand the next 20 years of geopolitics. The dollar will weaken, the renminbi will rise. The world will become multipolar, and the United States will be weaker than before. Not because of Chinese aggression, but because of U.S. policy. The United States once owned the goose that laid golden eggs, and it strangled it with sanctions. Welcome to the post-dollar world. It is not fully here yet, but it is very close. The timeline is set, the pattern is unmistakable. The SWIFT weapon was the trigger. And in 20 years, historians will look back at February 2022 and say, that was the moment U.S. financial power ended. Only at the time, very few people realized it. If you want to better understand how money, power, and geopolitics are quietly shaping our future, stay with Prosperity Pathways. Don't forget to like to support the content. Subscribe to the channel to not miss future analyses. And share this video with those you think also need to see the bigger picture behind the global monetary system. Awareness is the greatest advantage in a world that is changing faster than ever.